All right, so the first Gelli Print card we're gonna make is this one here. We're doing it with stamping and embossing. And I mean, the method for stamping and embossing for all three is exactly the same. The only difference is the stamp is different and the type of embossing powder is different. The ones that I've used for each card are going to be listed on the supply sheet. This one, I know it was a wrong choice for an embossing powder, but I didn't have a purple that, or a burgundy or whatever that matched properly. And I thought it was going to show up better until I actually did it. So, the reason I chose this one here is because even though these alcohol inks here have been lifted with acrylic paint, if I were to take one, let me find a print here. I'm trying to find a dark one here so that you can see it properly. If I were to take one and I'm just going to get some isopropyl and put some alcohol ink on it, those are going to move. And so for this card here that I'm doing, we're going to use some alcohol ink markers and we're going to color in the butterfly, and it's going to remove the print from the background. So you see how those alcohol inks still move even on that acrylic pull. So let's get our piece here. First thing we need to do is stamp it and emboss it, and I need to take this piece of paper back here because that's what we're stamping on. So I've got some Versamark ink, which is just a sticky clear ink. You need to have an embossing ink because it's going to stay wet long enough to hold the embossing powder while you're using the heat gun to melt it. If you use an ink that dries too quickly, it's just going to dry up the ink and the powder is going to start blowing off, and you're not going to get a nice clear embossing. This stamp is also great because it's got some really thick lines to it. All right, tap off the excess. Always do it on a scrap piece of paper because whatever goes onto that paper goes right back into the jar. Put that paper to the side, and now you need a embossing gun to heat it up. And you see how where it's not melted, it's matte and it's granular, but where it's melted, it's nice and shiny. That's how it's super easy to tell what part has been embossed and what part hasn't. There we go. Now, I didn't clean the extra embossing off of there. Mainly because I was trying to get this done quickly. But if you've got some extra embossing powder outside of your stamped image, take a thin brush and a small brush with a fine tip and just brush it off and clean it off before you melt it. Once it's melted, you can't do anything about it. So now, before I start doing this, see how you can see the pattern behind there? This is how we're going to, oops. We're using the brush tip of our alcohol marker, and it's the same markers that we were using for doing our prints earlier. And we're just going to color in some of those areas to make that butterfly really stand out. Now, alcohol ink is transparent. However, if you get some on the embossing powder, even the melted embossing powder, you will absolutely see it. So I'm trying to be sure to just do it inside the wings. I'm getting a little bit of it on top of the embossing powder. For what I've got right now, I'm not really worried about it. If you don't like it, you could take a Q-tip with some isopropyl and just clean it off. But it's just what you prefer. But you see how these markers are just taking that print from the back and clearing it off basically. And it's making that butterfly show up a little bit more because you don't have the print in the background that's competing with it. And I say taking it off, but it's not really taking it off, it's blending it out more. So where that dark part was there, it hasn't gone, it's just blended out a little bit more. And I'm not going to do it, but you could do it in all the little holes in the butterfly wings if you wanted. the lid off my glue. And I'm using the same Distress collage medium for gluing my cards together. This one is in a bottle with a needle nose for a fine tip so that I can get it exactly where I want it to be. So I'm gonna leave that aside to dry while I do the next step. I'm gonna put an acrylic block over it to hold it down because it wants to lift up. So the last step for this is, I've got my sentiment here. It is this set. I stamp an entire page and I cut them all down. So I stamp and emboss, so it's embossed with gold powder, and then I like to keep them so I have sentiments ready at a moment's notice. So I keep them all in a little tin. I've got a ton of them there. The stamping and embossing method is exactly the same as what we did for our butterfly here, but I want it to pop out of the card a little bit more, so I'm going to frame it with the same color that our card base is in. So first step is to put a little bit of glue on the back here. And to glue it down. And once that's glued down and not moving anywhere, you're going to take your trimmer and you're going to trim around those edges there. You definitely want to take some time to try to line it up as best as possible. I know when we're getting into areas where it's fairly thin around there, it is hard sometimes to line it up. Just do your best so that you've got a nice frame around it. And then because I want it popped up a little bit, I've got some foam pop dots here to put on the back. Hopefully this is down enough and I can put it wherever I want it basically. I'm trying to get it centered and then lined up just so that it's straight. Before I push it down, I just make sure that it's exactly where I want it to go. So there you go. We've got our first Gelli Print card with stamping and embossing. And remember, those other designs are exactly the same method, just a different stamp. So I'll see you in the next one, and we are going to do some cards with texture paste, or a card with texture paste.